Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've been camping all my life. I love the isolation, the crisp air, the sense of detachment from the world. You set up camp, share a few beers around the fire, and let the night's peaceful stillness wash over you. But this time, it was different. It was a cool October weekend, and my friends and I had decided to hike deep into Pine Ridge Forest. It's remote, sure, but that's what we loved about it. Untouched, serene. The only access road was long and winding, and we hadn't seen another car for miles. We arrived at our campsite just before sunset. The tall pines loomed above us, their silhouettes against the fading light making the forest feel ancient, like it had been here long before any of us. After setting up our tents, we started a fire, cracking jokes and passing around a flask. Typical stuff. But as the sky turned a deep indigo, something felt off. It started with the sounds, low, distant howls carried on the wind. Not wolves, not coyotes, something else. Something I couldn't quite place. The others didn't seem to notice at first, but I did. And once I pointed it out, everyone fell quiet, listening. There it was again, closer this time. A deep guttural groan like an animal in pain. But there was something unnatural about it. My friend Dave brushed it off, claiming it was just the wind, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We tried to ignore it, laughing nervously and turning our focus back to the fire. That's when we saw him, the park ranger. He stood just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the flickering light of the fire. Tall, broad shoulders, his ranger hat low over his face. There hadn't been a ranger station anywhere near the trail, but we assumed he was just out on patrol. "Hey there," Dave called out. "You need something?" The ranger didn't respond. He just stood there motionless, staring. At least, I think he was staring. The shadow cast by his hat made it hard to tell. We waited, but still nothing. The fire crackled and popped, and the silence between us grew thicker, heavier. My pulse quickened, a primal instinct kicking in, telling me something wasn't right. After what felt like an eternity, the ranger finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. He stepped back into the darkness, vanishing into the trees without a word. My friends laughed it off again, trying to break the tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The howls came back, louder now, and they seemed to echo from all around us. It wasn't just one sound anymore. It was several. They moved unnervingly fast through the woods, sometimes too far away to pinpoint, other times so close it felt like they were just beyond the tree line. The firelight flickered wildly, casting twisted shadows that danced and slithered across the ground. That's when we saw it again, the ranger. This time he was closer, just beyond the edge of the fire's glow. But something was different. His hat was gone. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, like he was trying to look at us from an angle that no human should be able to achieve. And then, the smell hit us. The stench of rotting meat, thick and sour. It was overwhelming, and I felt my stomach churn. I glanced at my friends. Their faces were pale, eyes wide. This wasn't a game anymore. "Let's get inside the tents," I whispered. But no one moved. The ranger, or whatever it was, took another step forward, and I saw it. His legs. They weren't right. They bent backward like a deer's. I could barely breathe as the realization hit me. This wasn't a man. It wasn't a ranger. Suddenly, Dave stood up. "Hey, what the hell do you want?" His voice shook, but he tried to sound brave. The thing paused, its head snapping back in a grotesque motion, like it had just noticed him for the first time. Slowly it lifted a hand, a long, distorted hand that stretched into claws, and pointed. It was pointing at Dave. Without warning, the howls returned, deafening this time, filling the forest with a cacophony of screams. And then the thing smiled. It smiled in a way that no human could ever smile, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. That's when we ran. We sprinted through the woods, not caring about our tents or gear, just trying to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. The howls followed us, snapping branches, the rustle of leaves getting closer, faster. My lungs burned, my legs screamed with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. We stumbled upon an old abandoned ranger station, a relic from decades ago. It was barely standing, but it was shelter. We barricaded ourselves inside, hearts pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by our desperate attempts to calm down. And then from outside, the familiar voice. "Hey, you guys okay in there?" It was Dave's voice. But Dave was right next to me. The blood drained from my face. My other friends stared at the door, trembling, wide-eyed. The voice came again, perfectly mimicking Dave's tone, his cadence. "Guys, come on, let me in." No one moved. We sat in stunned silence, paralyzed by fear. The voice outside turned sinister. "Come on, I just want to talk." It wasn't Dave. It wasn't anything human. The thing outside continued to taunt us, its voice shifting, becoming distorted, like a radio stuck between stations. I don't know how long we sat there waiting for it to leave. Hours, maybe. Eventually the forest grew quiet again. No more howls, no more footsteps. Just the dead silence of the night. But here's the part that still haunts me, the part that keeps me awake at night. When we finally built up the courage to leave that rotting ranger station and make our way back to the car, we found something just outside the door. A park ranger's hat, perfectly placed in the dirt, and Dave's voice, laughing softly from the shadows. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have never gone into the hollow woods alone. Everyone in town said it was cursed, but I thought they were just being superstitious. A place like that? Untouched for centuries, they said. People went in, but not many came out. The ones who did were never the same. It seemed like a challenge to me. I was the new guy in town, the outsider, and I had always loved exploring remote places. I told myself I wasn't afraid of ghost stories. I was smarter than that. I could handle it. Now, sitting here writing this by the dim glow of my flashlight, I realize I was wrong. Horribly, terrifyingly wrong. I went in yesterday morning planning to spend just one night. My pack was loaded with gear, enough food, water, and supplies to last me twice as long, just in case. The trail leading into the hollow woods was overgrown, barely visible in places. The trees were thick, their branches twisted together like they were trying to keep something out, or in. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on dead leaves and twigs. It was eerie, sure, but not enough to turn me back. I set up camp just before sunset, by a small stream that cut through the dense forest. The place had an ancient feel, like it hadn't been touched by time or people in centuries. The trees loomed overhead, their bark dark and slick, covered in moss and strange, spidery patterns that didn't look quite natural. I shrugged it off, telling myself I'd seen worse, but as the last light of day faded and darkness settled over the forest, the sense of unease grew. It started with the wind, except it wasn't really wind. It was more like a low, constant murmur that seemed to come from all directions at once. At first, I thought it was just the trees shifting in the breeze. But then I realized there was no breeze. The air was still heavy. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt alive. Not in the normal way forests do, with the rustling of animals and the calls of birds, but something deeper, like the ground itself was breathing, pulsing with an unseen force. I told myself it was just nerves. The stories had gotten under my skin, that's all. Then I heard it, a soft rustling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I looked up, my heart thudding in my chest, but saw nothing. just the dark shapes of trees, their branches swaying slightly in the... What? There was no wind. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it into the trees. The beam flickered slightly as I swept it across the undergrowth, casting long, dancing shadows. Nothing. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stared into the darkness, straining to hear anything besides the crackling of the fire and that low, unsettling murmur. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, like the sound of the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost make out words. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood again, shining my light into the trees, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just that whispering. It almost sounded like my name. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight all around the campsite. The forest loomed, dark and thick, but empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the light's reach, watching me. Then, just as quickly as it started, the whispering stopped. Silence. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. The fire crackled softly, the flames dancing, but the oppressive feeling of being watched didn't go away. And then from behind me, I heard it. A laugh, quiet, almost like a child's giggle, but it was wrong. Distorted, twisted. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark, landing on nothing. My breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I grabbed my knife, holding it in one hand while I scanned the trees, my eyes wide, heart hammering in my chest. The woods were too quiet, and the shadows seemed to be moving, shifting just out of sight. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the firelight. Just far enough that I could barely make it out. A tall, impossibly thin shape. Too tall to be a person. Its arms were long, dangling down almost to the ground, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw its face. Pale, hollow, with eyes that were nothing but black pits. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, my flashlight rolling away from me. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and the whispering started again, louder this time. Closer. The shadows around me seemed to twist and writhe like they were alive. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and shone it into the trees again. There was nothing there, but I knew. Something was watching me. I could feel it, could feel its eyes on me, hear its breath in the rustling leaves. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, watching the darkness, waiting for something to move, to step into the light. The whispering never stopped, and neither did the feeling that I was being watched. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and started hiking out of the valley. But the trail was wrong. The trees weren't where they should be. Landmarks I had passed on the way in were gone. It was like the forest had shifted overnight, like it was deliberately trying to keep me there. And the worst part? The whispering followed me. Even now, as I write this, sitting in what should be the safety of daylight, I can hear it. Just beneath the sound of the wind, just beyond the edge of my hearing. It's getting closer. I don't know if I'll make it out. But if you're reading this, if anyone is reading this, don't go into the hollow woods. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't look behind you. Because once you hear them, they never stop. It started as a weekend escape, a way to disconnect from our lives in the city and immerse ourselves in nature. Me, Ryan, Jess, and Kate had planned this camping trip for months, eagerly anticipating the peaceful isolation of Black Hollow Forest. It was remote, quiet, and as we had been told by a few locals, one of the most untouched forests left in the state. We didn't expect much beyond hiking, stargazing, and campfire stories. I wish we had stayed far, far away, We arrived at Black Hollow late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the towering pines. The forest had a stillness to it that was both calming and unsettling. It felt different, like it was watching us. Jess, the most experienced camper, found a perfect spot near a clearing, and we set up our tents. The evening crept in fast, the warmth of the fire a small comfort, as shadows lengthened across the trees. "Did you hear that?" Kate asked after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. She had a habit of being a little jumpy, but her voice had an edge of real concern. We all stopped and listened. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No usual night sounds, no crickets, no owls, just an eerie silence stretching on like the calm before a storm. "Probably nothing," Ryan shrugged, tossing another log on the fire. The crackle of the flames was the only thing keeping the oppressive quiet at bay. But then I heard it too. A distant sound, faint at first, like the wind carrying a voice, calling. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a cry for help. Jess stood up, squinting into the dark woods. "Someone's out there." None of us moved for a moment. We all just stared into the forest, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Then Ryan grabbed a flashlight. "We should go see if someone's lost." I didn't want to leave the fire. That sense of being watched only grew stronger, more oppressive, like the forest itself was pressing in around us. But Ryan was already heading into the trees, and Jess followed close behind. "Stay here with Kate," Jess said over her shoulder. "We won't go far." Kate and I sat in tense silence, listening as Ryan and Jess's footsteps faded into the woods. The light from their flashlight danced among the trees, then disappeared completely, swallowed by the night. A minute passed, then 5, then 10. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. "I'm going after them," I said, standing up and grabbing my own flashlight. "Stay here by the fire." Kate just nodded, her eyes wide with fear, clutching her knees as though that would keep her safe. I didn't want to leave her, but the silence that followed Ryan and Jess's departure gnawed at me. I stepped into the woods, calling their names. The trees were dense, the flashlight's beam barely cutting through the darkness. My breath was loud in the still air, the only sound aside from my feet crunching on dead leaves. "Ryan? Jess?" I called out, but there was no answer. Just that heavy, unnatural silence. I don't know how far I walked before I saw it, a light flickering up ahead. My heart leaped. They must have found someone, I thought. But as I got closer, I realized the light was wrong. It wasn't a flashlight, but a lantern, a soft yellow glow swaying gently in the air. And beneath it stood a man. He wore a park ranger uniform, his broad-brimmed hat shadowing his face. The strangest thing, though, was how still he was. Not a twitch or a shift in weight. Just standing there, watching. I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. "Are you looking for someone?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The ranger didn't respond at first, and when he finally did, his voice sounded strange, like it was coming from somewhere deep in his throat, as if he hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't be out here." "I'm with my friends," I said. "They went into the woods and "You need to leave," he interrupted, his head tilting ever so slightly. "This forest, it belongs to them." My skin prickled with dread. "Them? Who are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his lantern casting strange, shifting shadows across his face. I took a step back instinctively, and that's when I saw it, the way his legs bent at an unnatural angle, as if his joints weren't quite right. A horrible realization hit me all at once. This thing was not human. I turned and ran. The forest felt different now, twisted. The trees were closer together, the path more narrow. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I stumbled, desperate to get back to the fire, back to Kate. When I burst into the clearing, panting and wild-eyed, I found Kate standing by the fire. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, holding a lantern, was the ranger. "Kate, get away from him," I shouted, but Kate just stared at me, her face pale and expressionless. Then, with a sickening crack, the ranger's head turned toward me, far too far to the side, an inhuman twist. And from his mouth came a low, rumbling growl, followed by words that froze the blood in my veins. "They're already mine." Before I could react, the thing that looked like a ranger lunged, its body contorting, shifting. For just a second, its form flickered, its human skin melting away to reveal something far worse. A twisted, elongated creature with hollow eyes and skin stretched too tight over bone. A skinwalker. I backed away, my legs shaking, but Kate didn't move. She stood there, unblinking, her eyes dull. "Kate," I whispered, and that's when I noticed the subtle twitch beneath her skin, the too still way she was standing. I had been wrong. Kate wasn't safe at the campfire. She wasn't Kate at all. The fire crackled behind them, casting long, jagged shadows as they stepped forward, their bodies shifting and breaking into unnatural shapes. I realized, with a heart-stopping certainty, that whatever had taken them wasn't planning on letting me leave either. The forest belonged to them now, and soon I would too. I'll never forget that night deep in the woods, how the darkness felt thick, suffocating, almost alive, the kind of black that presses in from all sides, swallowing your thoughts until the only sound is the rhythm of your own breathing. I wasn't even supposed to be out there. It was a spur-of-the-moment trip, a last-ditch effort to clear my head after months of work and stress had weighed me down. Just me, my backpack, and the wide, open forest of Black Ridge. The hike had been exhausting, and by the time I found a decent clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. The ranger at the station, an older guy with a weathered face, had warned me to stick to the trails. His eyes were too serious for my liking, but I shrugged it off. I just needed one night away from it all. A fire, some stars, and silence. Silence. That was the first thing that started to bother me after I settled in. The usual forest sounds were absent. No rustling leaves, no insects buzzing, not even the distant call of an owl. Just stillness. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the crackling fire, the warmth against my face. But the quiet was unnerving, creeping into my bones. It wasn't until much later that I realized what should have tipped me off from the start. When the woods are quiet, it's because something out there has silenced them. I was dozing off when I heard it, something moving just beyond the glow of my fire. I sat up, straining my ears. A twig snapped, and then there was this soft, dragging sound. It stopped as soon as I stood up. I called out, my voice too loud in the unnatural silence. "Hello? Who's there?" Nothing. Just more quiet. My heart started hammering in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam over the edge of the clearing, half expecting to catch the reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature. But the light revealed nothing. Only trees, their twisted limbs casting shadows like long skeletal fingers. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A low guttural growl. I froze. Whatever it was big. Bigger than a deer. The growl deepened, vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. I backed toward the fire, my eyes darting between the shadows, but still. Nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard a voice. Faint, almost familiar, but warped. It called my name. John. I whipped around, shining the light toward the sound, but I saw nothing. No one. The voice came again, closer now, but wrong. Too stretched, like a recording played at half speed. "Johnny, come here." Panic started bubbling up. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here. No one should know my name. And that's when I saw him, the park ranger. His figure materialized from the shadows, standing just beyond the light. Relief washed over me for a second. I almost laughed. It was just him, the guy from the station. He must have been out on patrol. But then he stepped forward and I saw his eyes. They were black, like oil slicks void of anything human. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he didn't quite know how to use his limbs. My stomach turned. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, and that's when I noticed something horrifying. His skin wasn't right. It hung loosely like it didn't belong to him, stretched and sagging, as if it had been draped over his bones. "John," he whispered, his voice rasping, dragging out the syllables. "Come. With me." I stumbled back, heart racing, nearly tripping over my tent. This wasn't the ranger. This thing, whatever it was wearing him, like a grotesque costume. I bolted for the trees, leaving my gear and the fire behind, not daring to look back. Branches tore at my arms and face as I ran, blind and frantic, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned with every breath, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I could hear it. No, them. Following, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. And then I heard it again. Another voice, different this time. "John, over here." I skidded to a halt, almost collapsing from the sudden stop. Ahead of me stood another ranger, his flashlight flickering in the dark. This one looked real, his face lined with genuine concern. "Thank God," I gasped, staggering toward him. "There's something in the woods, it's—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice steady, but grave. "We need to move, now." Without waiting for my response, he grabbed my arm and pulled me along the trail. His pace was relentless, and I struggled to keep up. The sound of footsteps and rustling followed us, too close for comfort. Whatever it was, it hadn't given up the chase. As we rounded a bend in the trail, the ranger turned, his face illuminated by the moonlight. My heart dropped. His skin, it was too smooth, too perfect. And his eyes, black. Before I could scream, I felt cold fingers close around my neck from behind, yanking me back into the shadows. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the two rangers standing together, their faces splitting into identical, twisted smiles. Then silence. I woke up in the morning, sprawled on the ground next to the cold ashes of my fire. My gear was untouched, my body unharmed, but the forest, it was still, deathly still. I scrambled to my feet and ran all the way back to the ranger station. The older ranger was there, the real one, looking at me with concern as I burst through the door, out of breath and shaking. "You made it back," he said, his voice heavy with something like resignation. "What the hell was that out there?" I demanded, still shaking. "I warned you to stay on the trails," he interrupted softly, avoiding my eyes. "But once they've seen you, there's no going back." I never went camping again after that night. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear my name whispered on the wind. I'd been hearing about Hiker's Hollow for years, a secluded, unmarked trail deep in the forest, known only to a handful of local campers. It was famous for its eerie reputation, a place where people would go and come back, different. The rumors drew me in, like they always do. I wanted to see if the tales were true, if the hollow was as haunted as everyone claimed. So one weekend, I packed up my gear and headed out. The hike-in was beautiful. The trees were tall and dense, their branches reaching across the sky like fingers intertwined, blocking out the sun and casting everything in a cool green light. I followed the unmarked path winding through the trees, feeling the weight of the stories pressing in on me. They said that once you passed a certain point, you'd feel it. A heaviness, a pressure, like the forest itself was watching you. I thought it was just a story, but as I got deeper, I started to feel it too. By the time I found a spot to set up camp, the light was already starting to fade. I hurried to pitch my tent and start a fire, and as the flames crackled and sparked, I felt a strange sense of comfort. I'd heard the hollow was beautiful, but it was eerie too. The trees were thicker here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if they'd been bent by some unseen force. I had just settled by the fire, feeling the warmth chase away the evening chill, when I heard a noise, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I turned, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. I told myself it was just my nerves, but the feeling lingered. It was as if the whole forest had gone silent, holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the shadows. And then I saw him, a man standing just at the edge of the firelight watching me. He looked like a hiker. His clothes were dirty, worn, as if he'd been out here for days. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They were dark, empty, like twin pools of ink reflecting the flames. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, taking a step closer. "Nah." He didn't answer, just stared at me with that hollow gaze, and then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the darkness. I should have let him go, should have stayed by the fire, but something compelled me to follow. I grabbed my flashlight and walked after him, shining the beam into the shadows. The light flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw him again, just ahead of me, but when I reached the spot, he was gone. The forest was different here. The trees were thicker, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the sky. I walked deeper, the light from my campfire fading behind me, and the silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. It was then that I saw the clearing. In the middle of it was a circle of stones, arranged in a perfect ring, and at the center, something that looked like an old well, its edges crumbling with age. As I approached, I felt that heaviness again, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I shone my flashlight into the well, but it was too deep, the darkness too thick to see the bottom. That's when I heard the voice, soft and distant, coming from somewhere below. "Help me." I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice was faint, like it was coming from miles away, but there was something familiar about it. I leaned over the edge, listening, straining to hear, and then it came again, louder this time. "Help me." It sounded like my own voice. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how cold it had gotten. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the shadows around me seemed to shift, like they were watching, waiting. I turned to leave, but something held me in place, some invisible force rooting me to the spot. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the trees, their forms shrouded in darkness. They looked like hikers, their clothes dirty and torn, their faces pale and empty. They moved in unison, circling the well, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. And then one of them stepped forward. I recognized him. It was the man I'd seen before, the one who'd led me here. His face was blank, his eyes empty, but there was something in the way he moved, something familiar. I reached out, almost without thinking, and as my hand touched his, a flood of images filled my mind. I saw myself wandering through the forest, calling out for help. I saw myself alone, afraid, searching for a way out. And then I saw myself standing at the edge of the well, staring into the darkness as the shadows closed in around me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and the figures began to close in, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I turned and ran, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist around me, reaching out with twisted, gnarled fingers. I could hear their footsteps behind me, soft but relentless, as I sprinted through the trees, back towards the camp. When I burst into the clearing, the fire was out, the campsite empty. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to find some sign of where I'd come from, but everything was different. The trees were taller, the shadows deeper, and there was no sign of the path I'd taken. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. I stood there alone, the silence pressing in around me, and I knew I was trapped. The hollow had taken me, just like it had taken them. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that I'd become just another ghost, Another figure wandering the forest, calling for help that would never come. And if you ever find yourself in Hiker's Hollow, if you hear someone calling out from the darkness, don't follow them. Turn back, get out, while you still can. Because once you're in that place, it won't let you go. It will trap you, keep you until you're nothing but a shadow, a whisper, a faint cry lost in the trees. So if you ever hear a voice calling your name, remember this: it could be the forest, or it could be me. I work as a backcountry camping guide. I've spent most of my life in the woods, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about these places, until last summer. I was leading a small group on a 5-day trek through Cedar Hollow, one of the oldest forests in the region. It's a dense, almost impenetrable stretch of wilderness filled with ancient trees that seem to bend toward you, whispering secrets you don't want to hear. We had set up camp on the second night, deep in the heart of the woods. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that slithered between the trees. My group, a mix of seasoned campers and weekend adventurers, was huddled around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. I was on edge, though. There was a strange feeling in the air, a heaviness I couldn't quite place. As the evening wore on, I heard it, a faint shuffling sound like something dragging itself through the underbrush. It was distant at first, so I brushed it off as an animal foraging for food, but the noise grew louder, closer and more deliberate, like someone was watching us. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, but saw nothing. The others were oblivious, too engrossed in their conversations to notice. Around midnight, everyone had turned in for the night. I stayed up, staring into the embers, that uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. The night was unnaturally still, and the usual chorus of crickets and owls was absent. Then I heard it again, the shuffling, this time accompanied by a low, raspy breathing. I turned my flashlight on and swept it across the trees, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness, revealing nothing but twisted branches and shadows. As I turned back toward the camp, I caught a glimpse of something. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, there was a figure standing between the trees. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs too long and joints that bent in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and taut, stretched over its skeletal frame like a thin sheet of paper. But its face, that was the worst part. It had no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to suck in the darkness, and a mouth that stretched into a sickening grin filled with jagged teeth. I blinked and it was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of something rotten. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my tired mind playing games. But deep down, I knew it was real. The next morning, I didn't mention what I saw. I figured there was no need to scare anyone unnecessarily. We packed up and continued our trek, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, lurking just out of sight. On the fourth day, as we made our way through a particularly dense part of the forest, we found something strange. A circle of trees, each one marked with a strange symbol carved deep into the bark. It looked almost like an eye, with jagged lines radiating from the center. My stomach twisted as I realized the trees were arranged in a perfect circle, surrounding a mound of dirt that looked freshly disturbed. One of the campers, a guy named Tom, joked about it being a burial site, but no one laughed. There was something wrong about that place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We moved on quickly, but I could feel those empty sockets watching us, could sense that grin lingering just beyond the trees. That night we set up camp by a stream, hoping the sound of running water would drown out the silence. But as soon as darkness fell, the shuffling started again. It circled our camp, staying just out of sight, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my knife, my ears straining to catch every sound. At one point I thought I saw it standing at the edge of the camp, watching us with that awful grin, but when I blinked, it was gone. The last day we hurried through the woods, desperate to put distance between ourselves and whatever was stalking us. We reached the edge of the forest by late afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the trees, a welcome relief after days of darkness. I was the last to leave, bringing up the rear to make sure no one was left behind. As I stepped onto the trail, I looked back one last time. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was the figure. It raised a bony hand and pointed at me, its mouth stretching into that grotesque grin, as if to say it would see me again. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at the ranger station. I quit my job a week later. The others, they laughed it off as a strange experience, a creepy story to tell at parties. But I knew better. I knew that thing was still out there, waiting for its next prey. And sometimes late at night I hear it outside my window, the shuffling, the raspy breathing. It's waiting, and I know it will come for me someday. Out there in the woods, something unnatural walks at night. It watches, it waits, and if you're unlucky enough to catch its eye, it never lets you go. I grew up hearing stories about Shadow Creek, a secluded stretch of wilderness deep in the Smoky Mountains, where even the bravest hunters rarely tread. My uncle, who worked as a park ranger there, used to tell me about strange happenings in those woods, sounds that didn't belong to any animal he knew, shadows that moved without any source of light. I always thought he was just trying to scare me, until the summer I joined him on patrol. It was late August, just as the summer haze was starting to lift, and we were heading out for an overnight shift. The park had reported a series of missing campers in the area, and though no one had found any bodies, rumors were spreading. Some said it was bears, others thought it was just people getting lost. But my uncle seemed nervous, and that alone was enough to make me uneasy. We hiked up to our post, a small cabin nestled in a clearing a few miles from the main trail. By the time we arrived, it was dusk, and the woods had taken on a strange, oppressive silence. As we settled in, my uncle laid down the rules. No wandering off alone, stay inside after dark, and if you hear anything unusual, don't go looking for it. I laughed, thinking he was just being dramatic, but he wasn't laughing with me. As night fell, the woods around us grew eerily quiet. I'd expected to hear the usual forest sounds, crickets, owls, maybe the rustling of deer, but there was nothing. Just an unnatural, heavy silence. I tried to shake off the feeling that we were being watched, but it was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the tree line. Around midnight, the quiet was shattered by a blood-curdling howl, so loud and so unnatural that I felt it in my bones. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost human, but twisted, like the sound was being dragged from a throat that hadn't made a noise in years. My uncle paled, grabbed his rifle, and looked at me with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It's the Dogman," he whispered. "We need to stay quiet." I'd heard of the Dogman before, a local legend about a creature that was part wolf, part human, and all nightmare. Supposedly, it hunted at night, preying on anyone foolish enough to wander into its territory. I never believed in it, but as the howls grew closer, I wasn't so sure anymore. Suddenly, there was a scratching sound at the door. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. My uncle motioned for me to stay back as he approached the door, gun raised. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low guttural growl that seemed to shake the entire cabin. Slowly, he peeked out the window, then turned to me with wide, terrified eyes. "It's right outside," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, listening to the creature's heavy breathing on the other side of the thin wooden door. Then, without warning, the growling stopped. The silence returned, but it was somehow worse. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to hope that it was over. My uncle finally lowered his gun, motioning for me to follow him back into the main room. He said we needed to wait until dawn, that it was too dangerous to leave before then. Just as we were starting to relax, a loud bang shook the cabin, as if something massive had thrown itself against the door. The wood splintered, and through the crack, I caught a glimpse of something that still haunts my dreams. It was tall, with matted fur and long twisted limbs. Its face was a grotesque mix of wolf and man, with sharp yellowed teeth and eyes that glowed like embers. It stared right at me, and in that moment, I felt as though it had looked into my soul. My uncle fired a shot, and the creature let out an ear-splitting scream before retreating into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. Grabbing what we could, we bolted into the woods, running blindly through the trees, praying that we could reach the main trail before the creature found us again. We made it back just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I could barely breathe, but I was alive. We reported what we'd seen, but no one believed us. They said it was just a bear, maybe a wolf, and that we'd imagined the rest. But I know what I saw. A week later, they found another campsite torn apart near Shadow Creek, with claw marks and bloody trails leading off into the woods. They still haven't found the bodies. My uncle quit his job not long after that, and I've never gone back to Shadow Creek. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear that howl, echoing through the mountains, a reminder that some legends are real. So if you ever find yourself near Shadow Creek, remember, you may not believe in the Dogman, but it believes in you. And it's always watching, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close to its lair. I'm telling you this not because I want to. I'm telling you because you need to hear it, and maybe, just maybe, this story will keep you from making the same mistake I did. I'm a park ranger, been one for almost 12 years now, working at a remote forest reserve that's miles away from the nearest town. It's the kind of place where your only companions are the trees, the animals, and the occasional lost hiker. I've always liked the isolation, gave me peace, gave me time to think. But that was before last summer, before the night that changed everything. I was on a routine patrol, one of those night shifts that usually just involves scaring off the odd bear or picking up after careless campers. I remember the night was unnaturally quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. It was almost suffocating, and then, just past midnight, the radio crackled. Base to Ranger, we've got reports of strange noises near Ridge Trail. Might be an animal in distress. Can you check it out? I sighed. Ridge Trail was miles from where I was, but it was my job. I drove as far as the dirt path would allow, then grabbed my flashlight and started hiking up the trail. I'd been there 100 times, but that night every step felt wrong, like I was trespassing on something I shouldn't be. The air grew thicker the deeper I went. The trees seemed to close in, and shadows played tricks on my eyes, stretching and shifting like they had minds of their own. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl. It echoed through the trees, chilling me to the bone. I stood still, scanning the forest with my flashlight. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees and darkness. I told myself it was probably a coyote or maybe a bear, but something about the growl. It was wrong. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded almost human. I continued down the trail, every nerve on edge. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse at first, something moving between the trees. It was tall, taller than any human, and its limbs were elongated, almost spider-like. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding between the trees as if it was part of them. My flashlight caught its eyes, red, glowing eyes that stared back at me with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen. Then, it started moving toward me, faster now, its movements jerky and disjointed. I stumbled back, tripping over roots and underbrush, barely managing to keep my balance as I turned and bolted down the trail. The thing chased after me, its footsteps unnaturally quiet, as if it was hovering just above the ground. I could hear it breathing, a raspy, wet sound that echoed in the silence of the forest. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Just as I thought it was gaining on me, I saw the lights of my truck. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and fumbled with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped them. The headlights illuminated the trail ahead, but there was nothing there, no sign of the creature. I took a moment to catch my breath, laughing nervously, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. But then, something slammed into the side of the truck, rocking it violently. I screamed and floored the gas pedal, tearing down the trail faster than I'd ever driven in my life. When I got back to the station, I was a mess. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. They said it was probably a bear, maybe even a hallucination from being tired. But I know what I saw. I took a few days off, thinking some rest would help me clear my head. But when I returned to work, things got worse. I started seeing shadows in the forest that didn't belong, hearing whispers at night when I was alone. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew the truth. The thing I saw wasn't just an animal. It was something older, something evil. Last week I found a note in my locker. No one knew how it got there. It wasn't written in any language I recognized, just strange symbols and a drawing of an elongated figure with red eyes. I took it to the local historian, hoping for some answers. He went pale when he saw it, refused to even touch the paper. He told me about legends of skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic humans, lure them into the woods, and steal their souls. I laughed it off at the time, but now, I'm not so sure. I'm telling you this because last night I saw it again. Standing outside my window, those red eyes staring back at me, just waiting. I don't know how it found me, but I can feel it watching, even now. I can't sleep, I can't think. I know it's only a matter of time before it gets me. So if you're ever in the woods and you see something that doesn't feel right, something with red eyes watching you, run. Run and don't look back. And pray that it doesn't follow you home. Because once it does, there's no escaping it. I don't know why I thought solo camping would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress of work, the constant buzz of my phone, or the weight of everyday life grinding me down. I needed to get away from it all, just for a weekend. I needed the peace and quiet of the wilderness. I chose a spot far off the beaten path, deep in a national forest where the nearest trail was miles away. It was just me, my tent, and the woods. The drive was long, but once I parked and started the hike, the air felt fresher, the silence more profound. No more people, no more noise, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. It was perfect. I set up my tent near a small stream and built a fire as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. The crackling flames were the only sound as I sat there, alone but comfortable, the quiet exactly what I'd been craving. But as the night closed in, the sense of isolation grew heavier. By the time the fire was nothing but glowing embers, the forest was pitch black. The only light came from the stars, dimly visible through the treetops. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay back in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the night. It was peaceful at first, just the usual forest noises, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets. But then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had jolted me out of sleep. At first I thought it was just the disorienting quiet, the absence of the familiar city sounds. But then I heard it, a distant, rhythmic tapping, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a natural sound like an animal moving through the brush. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I listened, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch tapping against a tree moved by the wind, but there was no wind. The air was still, unnervingly so. The tapping continued, slow and steady. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, but as I listened, it grew louder, as if it was getting closer. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but none came. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear beyond the thin walls of the tent. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself had gone still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. I told myself it was nothing, that I was alone and it was all in my head. But then I heard something new. Footsteps. Faint at first, but growing louder. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly over the dry leaves and twigs. Someone, or something, was walking through the woods, getting closer to my camp. Panic surged through me. I reached for the flashlight I'd left beside my sleeping bag and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent. But out there, beyond the fabric walls, everything was black. I unzipped the tent just a fraction, enough to peer out. The fire was completely out now, and the moonlight barely illuminated the clearing. My eyes scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the dense, dark forest pressing in on all sides. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the faint moonlight, there was a figure, standing still. Too still. At first I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but no. It was shaped like a person. It was just standing there, at the tree line, motionless. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, hoping I was seeing things. But no, it was still there, just standing, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadowy silhouette against the trees. For a long, heart-pounding moment, neither of us moved. My mind raced. Who was out here, this deep in the forest? I hadn't seen a single person since I started the hike. This area wasn't even on most maps. It didn't make sense. I didn't know what to do. My gear was scattered around the campsite, my car miles away. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows. And then slowly it stepped forward. The sound of its footsteps breaking the silence was like a gunshot. It moved slowly, one deliberate step at a time, as if it had all the time in the world. I panicked. I zipped the tent shut and backed away, flashlight shaking in my hand, casting erratic beams of light around the small space. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to think, tried to figure out what to do. The footsteps grew louder. I sat there frozen, flashlight pointed at the tent flap, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. I listened, my breath shallow, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing. Just silence. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I gathered the courage to peek out again. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, wide awake, flashlight in hand, waiting for the figure to return, but it never did. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as fast as I could and hiked back to my car without looking back. I don't know what or who that figure was, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there, and I'm never camping alone again. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, that gives me a strange sense of peace. But that night, that trip, it changed everything. I had decided to go camping alone, something I'd done many times before. It was late autumn, and the leaves had turned a deep orange and red, creating a canopy of colors above me as I hiked through the forest. I had picked a remote spot near a lake I'd heard about from some locals, about 2 hours north of the nearest town. Quiet and peaceful, they said. Perfect. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, creeping shadows through the trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and lit a small fire. The crackling of the wood was the only sound in the forest. No birds, no wind, just silence. At first I enjoyed it, but as the darkness deepened, the quiet began to feel oppressive, like the trees were watching me, waiting for something. I told myself it was just my imagination and settled into my tent after the fire died down. That's when I first heard it. A soft rustling outside, barely noticeable, like something small moving through the underbrush. I sat up, straining to listen, my heart beating faster. Maybe it was a raccoon or some small animal. But then the sound stopped, replaced by a heavy, rhythmic crunch. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening as they moved closer to my tent, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't care about being heard. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind that had suddenly picked up. The footsteps stopped too. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, curious about my camp. But as I zipped the tent back up, I noticed something strange. All around my campsite, the forest was still again, unnaturally so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. Hours passed, and just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time, closer. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps circled the tent, slowly, deliberately, and then stopped right by my head. I gripped the flashlight, ready to shine it out, but something told me not to. I didn't want to know what was out there. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent. I didn't move, didn't breathe, and then a voice, a low, raspy whisper, like someone speaking right into my ear from the other side of the tent wall. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably human. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an animal. Someone was out there, messing with me. I scrambled for my phone, my hand shaking as I tried to unlock it. Before I could call anyone, the whispering stopped and a loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by a deep, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard. My tent shuddered like something massive had brushed up against it. I bolted upright, tearing through the zipper and stumbling out into the darkness. I shone my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. Just trees, tall and looming, casting long shadows in the dim light. The growl came again, this time from the direction of the lake. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what to do, where to go. I was alone, miles from civilization, with no help coming. But then, something changed. The air grew cold, unnaturally cold for autumn, and I noticed something near the edge of the lake, barely visible in the mist that had started to roll in. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless. I tried to focus the flashlight, but the beam flickered, dimming as if the battery was dying. The figure began to move, slow and jerky, like it wasn't used to walking. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted through the trees, the ground uneven and littered with roots. Behind me I could hear those footsteps again, faster now, keeping pace with me. I didn't dare look back. I ran for what felt like hours, until I reached a road, a small dirt path that I hadn't even known existed. Collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath, I looked back into the forest. Nothing, no figure, no footsteps, just the wind rustling the trees. I managed to get back to my car and drive straight home, shaking the entire way. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had spooked myself out. But then, a few days later, I heard something that still makes my skin crawl. I was telling a friend about the trip when he interrupted me. "That lake, did you say it was near Mason Ridge?" I nodded, confused. He went pale. "People don't go there anymore," he said quietly. "Not since that hiker went missing a few years back. They found his camp, but not him. His stuff was still there, untouched, and his tent, it was slashed open from the inside." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I hadn't heard about the missing hiker before, but now every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder, was I really alone out there? Or did I come too close to the same fate? And I still don't know what I heard or saw that night, but I'll never go back. Some places are better left alone,